Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this installment of the PHUSE video series, Open Source Technologies in Clinical Data Analytics. My name is Michael Rimler, and I am the Open Source Technologies Director for PHUSE. Joining us today are Patti Compton and Mike Smith from Pfizer. Mike is a Senior Director at Pfizer and a self-proclaimed professional geek. As the lead of Pfizer's R Center of Excellence, Mike is building Pfizer's R community internally and leading the way to integrating R and other open source tools into its clinical reporting process. Patti is Vice President and Head of Statistical Data Science and Analytics at Pfizer. This means that Patti is ultimately responsible for the quality and efficiency of clinical analysis deliverables, which support submissions and key internal decisions, regardless of how they're generated. Thank you both for joining us, Patti and Mike. I guess where I'd like to start is a bit on where Pfizer is in its open source journey, at least within clinical reporting and submissions. So can you tell us a bit more about where Pfizer is in its open source journey? Like what is Pfizer's ultimate purpose here? What's that value proposition?
Well, we've used R at Pfizer for many years, probably 15 years plus at the minute, but primarily that's been in the clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics worlds where they use it for model diagnostics and for contributing to reports in their world, particularly for submission reports. And the non-clinical group at Pfizer has also been using R for many, many years. We've just started the process of looking at how we can transition from being SaaS-based to being predominantly R-based for clinical trial reporting within the SDSA group. It's early days. We're working it out. We are capitalizing on great work that has been done externally and looking at what we can bring in internally and kind of gearing up for the future, thinking that, if what we want to get to is that R is the predominant tool in this workflow, but trying to kind of re-engineer things to be open to other analytic tools and other tools that might come along in future. So I liken it to that age-old thing of trying to change the wheels on the bus while it's rolling down the highway. Drug development doesn't stop while we retool and figure all this out. And so that's one of the big challenges for us, is to see how we can make that swap and not get in the way of our day jobs, which is getting clinical trial results reported.
As Mike said, we have been growing a set of open source tools for a long time, and we're really changing our strategy to focus on a couple purposes. One is that utilizing open source gives us access to new and emerging talents from both academia and other industries. That is critical in terms of modernizing our approach to data analysis. And then the second is building on our opportunity to collaborate. We need to have much more accessible, reusable code in order to be more transparent on our analysis to multiple stakeholders. Frankly, our North Star, if you like, is we really need additional capabilities to make the most of our data. And this means we need investments in open source tools, languages like R, investments in AI, ML with languages like Python and other languages. As Mike said, there have been a lot of challenges of how we build this holistically within our organization. And I think that's what we need to do, is sort of continue to set or level that playing field. We have a lot of folks who understand R. We have a lot of folks who understand Python. But we need more clear, established guidelines to ensure consistency, quality, privacy, consent, and frankly, a bit more direction on which tools can be used where and for which purposes. And as we're, I guess, to use Mike's analogy, changing the wheels on that rolling bus as we go, it's these sorts of guidelines that will allow us to exponentially grow and get more value out of our data, which is the gold mine we're frankly sitting on, as is every organization. And there's just a huge amount of opportunity there.
Thanks,
I think it's
Patti.
also important to recognize that the change isn't just for the sake of it. right? We're not just deciding to make this transition to open source just because, well, it's a neat thing to do. We are looking at the working groups that are happening through PHUSE and our consortium and various other places. And the regulators are involved in that discussion to say, we want to be able to review your submissions faster. We don't want to just continue on the route that we have for the last 30 odd years of static outputs and wading through page after page, but we need better ways to review and come to a conclusion faster. So I think that that's another driver for taking a time to go, this change is going to happen anyway, so we need to be right there ready to go with it and not get left behind.
That's great, Mike, and thanks, Patti, for your thoughts as well. I think that there's been some other organizations that are quite open about how they're incorporating open source into clinical trial reporting. And it's really good to get a bit of a peek behind the curtain with what's going on within Pfizer as well. So thanks for that. I wanted to get to know you a little bit better as well. And maybe we'll start with Mike. When you think about your current role as in our Center for Excellence in that, what are the elements of your experiences and expertise that drew you to this type of role that ultimately kind of put you in the position that you're in now?
As you said in the introduction, I view myself as a professional geek. So I like being at the interface between the business and the kind of digital domain, the IT world domain of systems and processes and latest, greatest tools to try and make things more efficient. And so I've been aware of Pharmaverse and that incoming wave of technologies to do really interesting stuff. As a company, we've been involved in PHUSE working groups, our consortium working groups. Pfizer led the Admiral vaccine development. So we've kind of been involved, I would say, but we are kind of turning up the heat and going, we need to be actively involved and actively bringing this stuff in so that we know what to do with it when we get our hands on it. Open source development isn't just looking over someone else's fence and going, hey, I like the look of what you have, I'll take it and use it. It's also contributing back. So it's testing things out. It's trying to help improve these tools, help improve workflows, help make new things happen, make them happen faster. And frankly, it's only through these consortia that we have that influence and that engagement across industry and again with regulators.
And Patti, how has your role been impacted trying to support some of these activities, these collaborations and contributions that Mike's talking about?
Well, I see my role as a key support to the professional geek community because I do believe that it promises to create more collaboration, create more accessibility to not just us internally, but to external researchers and health authorities. I am constantly reminded how much time health authorities spend reviewing our data, remapping our data, just to come to the same conclusions. Frankly, it hurts my soul when I hear how much data has to be remapped to draw the same conclusions. I feel investments in open source can drive some ease and some efficiency. And I think it will extend beyond just the health authorities to external researchers, frankly, even patients. And my role is to help prioritize and get these conversations going, help establish some of these guidelines, both internally and externally with industry forums like PHUSE. I think that is a change in stance where a lot of us have not understood just how far these sorts of efforts can take us in the review cycle time, that it doesn't need to be sort of one and done. It can be much more digitized and much more accessible and reducing the burden on our health authorities. So I want to see this sort of impact happen during my tenure. And view support of PHUSE and other industry forums.
Thanks, Patti. Now, Mike, I come back to you. As a leader in this space, a lot of the work that you're doing is in R. But tell me a little bit more about your personal reasons for expanding to open source. You mentioned a little bit about this earlier, but maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the sources of value that you see with open source.
The open source bit of it is as much about collaboration across pharma. We all have a lot of the same problems that we face. How do we get our data together to standards? How do we report out our results? How do we visualize stuff? How do we help people understand that data? But also things like the nuts and bolts of how do we validate R and R packages? What skill sets should people have to be able to do this work? And I see a huge shift. I mean, I've been in industry 30 years, but I see a huge shift, even just in the last 2 years, of general openness and the willingness to talk to each other and collaborate and help solve these big problems together. We see people sharing training curricula. We see, workflows and how do you manage our environment. This is fantastic stuff. I mean, it lights up all my geeky lights here, but we can only solve these problems by working together, right? Because otherwise Pfizer solve it and GSK solve it and Roche solve it and Lilly solve it. And that's just wheel spin. Why shouldn't we work together to try to address these big problems? I know the future is going to be really different, and I'm excited about what shape that's going to take. And I have this analogy that, 30 years ago, encyclopedias were things you found on the bookshelves in libraries. And who would have thought 30 years ago that an open, curated, online encyclopedia where anyone can contribute could revolutionize knowledge sharing today? And people would have laughed at you 30 years ago if you'd suggested this, but now we have it on everybody's phone and computer, and at any browser, you can get access to this information. Now, I would hope that things might transform that much, in the next 30 years, but it might go in directions that we have no possible way of knowing right now. But the other thing I come back to is that I think the key driver here is that our intellectual property is in the medicines and therapies that we develop and the data that we collect from our clinical trials. It's not in how we construct a plot or how we construct a listing or a summary table. So if we can solve those problems collectively, that leaves space for the rest, the more interesting tasks of understanding our data, as Patti said.
Yeah, early on when I was getting involved with open source and clinical data analytics, it was similar, looking for trying to make that argument to senior leadership about where the value was in terms of contributions in that, and it was having those visionary leaders that could see that. Sure, Patti, you faced this as well as you were deciding to devote resource into these things that are ultimately sharing the output of the investment of the resources in your organizations towards these contributions. Patti, can you tell us a little about your reasons for wanting to invest in open source a little bit deeper than what you've already talked about?
Yeah. So one, I think we're on the hook to demonstrate productivity across the clinical development continuum. It takes too long to get drugs to market. And this is a space for us to collaborate deeply. And to execute on these projects, we really need to develop the data science community, the statistical programming community. We do need that rich library ecosystem and platform independence in order to take time out of that drug development continuum. Other industries have done it. We should do that as well. I think, we have built some capabilities using R and Python, and industry forums are focusing on that area. We need to draw the line in the sand a little bit deeper. Commit to using this code. Commit to using this, as confirmatory. We have to have the next level of conversation to reduce the burden internally and externally. The technology is there. We just need to organize it a bit better, share a little bit more examples, come to a little deeper understanding on the guidelines on which decisions can be made, not swirl around on some of these decisions. And I think a lot of the industry forums are heading that way. We can even organize across our disciplines. It's not just programming, it's not just stats. You see this happening in lots of spaces across that development continuum. And so for me, I think it is sort of putting that pen to the paper or the digital line, moving us out of paper and committing, this is where we're going to use this open source code. It's transparent. It can be used in the concept of like R packages for analysis, as well as AIML. I think having a lower barrier to entry in this space, whether it's through training or the ecosystem, are the key hallmarks of how we will be successful and meaningfully take time out of the timelines, non-competitive or pre-competitive space that I think we're obligated to do.
Thanks, Patti. I want to close out with one last question that I'll just put to each of you. What do you think the next 2 to 3 years of life sciences is going to look like? What do you think we should expect to see?
Just after having said that, I don't like predicting the future. I would like to see submissions to FDA using interactive data, tools like Shiny or equivalents of that, where rather than static outputs and having plots and visualizations that are the kind of old paper way of doing things, where you bake in every single facet of information that anyone might want to see, so that if that plot gets out of context, that your p-values are baked onto it, right? I would much rather see things that would allow reviewers to dig through data and see, well, this subject had an adverse event here, but what else was going on at that moment in terms of concomitant therapies or concomitant indications and things like this, so that it's easier to see the whole story of what's happening in that data set. And also, frankly, I'd quite like to see nicer graphs, because, from a design perspective, some of them are really could be improved. So that's where I think, the data scientists can work with statisticians to meet that happy balance of something that conveys information quickly, but it has that richness to dig into it and say, show me other layers of this information to help me understand it better.
Mike's right on. We have to instantiate our capabilities in open source, in R and Python, across our whole community. That will continue. We're going to be applying these efforts in whole new ways. We'll be looking at wearables to drive endpoints. We will be continuing to expand in discovery. We will have smart tools for operational excellence, and we'll be measured on it. I think that we will see more shared platforms with the health authorities. PDUFA 7 requires that at least the FDA have 3 demonstration projects of a cloud environment. We will learn those rules of engagement, and I would say in the next 2 years we will see some areas start to be streamed, whether it's the label negotiations, the CMC type data, the clinical data. That will continue, and it will be a new way of submitting. We're not just going to throw things over the fence. There will be a lot more real-time discussion. And that just means for us, we need accessible code. We need to advance our code. We need to understand how we're going to share our data more effectively. And open source is the highway to do that. So I think in 2 years, much more interactive platforms, much more expectation in terms of our job qualifications in this space.
That's really interesting. I think others share similar views as you both are mentioning about the next 2 to 3 years, and it's great to hear from you on that. With that, I think we'll close out. I'd like to thank you both again for your time and perspectives today. It's great to hear. I mean, this is you, to me, you represent this thought and strategic leadership when it comes to how Pfizer is incorporating open source and how you decide to deliver your clinical data analytics, whether or not that ultimately does include solutions in the open source. To those watching, I hope that you've enjoyed the session today with Mike Smith and Patti Compton from Pfizer. So until next time, my friends, thank you very much.